All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Katie Clare. I'm director of our marketing services team at Travel Oregon. Thank you so much for being here in our very exciting brand session. We're thrilled to have you here. Before we get started, I'm going to play a short video for you from one of our breakout session sponsors. So excuse me while I close that real quick. Yeah, everyone, this is a presentation of my children. Thank you all for being here. What we're really excited about today is I'm so happy and thrilled to introduce our senior strategist from Wieden & Kennedy, Anthony Holton. And I'm going to get the title just right. And I also know you just did your dissertation as well. So the PhD, Dr. Josh Loebner, Executive Director of Inclusion and Accessibility for Design Sensory. Something that we feel is critical and so valuable when you talk and design your brand is to make it in a way that you can continue to evolve while staying true to who you are and what your destination is, but make room for voices that you might not have had conversations with before. So today we're going to talk about how I think the only thing that we can all agree on in this room 100% is that we don't know what we don't know yet, and something will happen that will completely rock us sometime in the future. So how do we make strong foundations within our brand and our work that will allow us to accommodate things in the future? And while we don't have that 100% locked in, we're going to share some really great best practices with you and some just really good insights. So we'll have presentations in the beginning from both of our panelists today, and then one of the most valuable things that I think both of them bring to the table is conversation and questions that will happen after the presentation. So please listen and take this in, but also let's talk about it. Let's talk about brand. Let's talk about what this means to you, and let's see how we can all collaborate and make all tourism brands in Oregon a little bit better tomorrow. So with that, I'm going to introduce Anthony, our first speaker.
Hello, everyone. Hey. So I think I was really excited to be able to come and do this. I think the hope here is to to a very kind of high level, like fundamentals type things. I know there's a lot going on and a lot changing in the industry and as it relates to brands. And I know everybody's coming from a different place. So the hope is to get a nice baseline and then, later on with questions and stuff, get into kind of more detail. So let's do it. So the three kind of questions that like this whole presentation is centered around is one, what is a brand? Two, why are they important? And three, how do they kind of adapt and evolve? So that'll be sort of the structure of it. And the hope, I think, is to have a little fun with it. Hopefully it provokes some thoughts and we can talk about it again at the end. So the first step, what is a brand? Which is kind of an interesting question. And when I talk to like the different strategists I work with at the agency, it's one that like we work on them every day, but if you ask somebody to explain it, they'll kind of pause a little bit and be like, what is a brand? So I always like those moments where you're kind of forced to lean in a bit more and think about it. And it doesn't help if you just type it into Google. I was like looking through all the array of different definitions. And I was like, these all are kind of different and each could take you in a different direction. So for the purposes of today, the one that I settled on that was interesting was a brand is kind of the layer of meaning we wrap around a product. And that can be a place, a service, an experience, et cetera. And I know like what a product is in today's day and age can vary. But it's sort of the story that we tell around it and that layer of meaning that we assign to it. It's the difference between a $10 t-shirt and an $1,800 t-shirt. I know this is kind of a frivolous example and one that's kind of hard to see on the screen, but I think it's emblematic of the value that people place on brands. And it's not as simple as just sort of the good itself, but the story that's wrapped around it. That can be really important, not just monetarily, but from a value standpoint and kind of deeper things. And so brands operate as kind of identities, the story we tell about who we are as organizations, companies, destinations, whatever it is. And I think a really clearly defined brand and one that's really in touch with its story, people tend to want to borrow or associate with, to be like, hey, that speaks to something in me. I'm more than happy to like support that, be invested in that, and make it a part of my life. And that story of brands typically is made up of these kinds of questions of who are we? Where do we come from? Why is it that we do what we do? What is it that we believe? What makes us special? Why should others care? So a lot of like questions that seem really deep, but I think can be really fruitful if you really take a step back. Because I know it's easy to get kind of lost in the day-to-day. I think somebody said earlier in the conference too, like the urgent versus the important. And I think taking those moments to step back and really define where it is you're coming from, I think will allow people to feel that more readily. And as far as stories go, this is an example, Bill Bowerman, really important to the founding of Nike. Nike's a brand I work on a lot, so there's a few of those examples in here. Plus the Oregon tie-in, I was like, this is probably a good example. But so yeah, he's a track coach at Oregon, Coach Steve Prefontaine, Phil Knight. But he would make shoes for his athletes using a waffle iron. And there's something in that though that I think bubbled out of that and continues to be a through line for that brand today of listening to the voice of the athlete. And so there was a simple truth that was just true of what he was doing at the time, but really in this interaction, in this exchange, it'll tell you all you need to know about like what the brand is today even. So finding those deeper truths about your brand, which I'll come back to later, is really important and continue to be sort of like an anchor point for how you build the brand and the worlds around it. And so brands, like when they're really in touch with their story, they're able to become kind of these bundles of associations and feelings. Like if I throw a Disney logo on the screen, that invokes a feeling inside of you. A Fisher Price logo, that invokes a feeling inside of you, and all the memories that are associated with that, you sort of bubble to the surface. And so strong brands have that effect of communicating that broader thing, which is really special. And what becomes really clear when you look at kind of the brands on the previous slide is that they're much more than just products. There's sort of that additional quality to it that allows people to tap into it in a new way. A quick example too, if I tell you, hey, can I interest you in a majestic coastline full of quaint shops, unforgettable views, and an iconic rock? It sounds nice and it's cool, but there's something about it where you're like, yeah, no, that sounds good, but it's a bit loose. But when I call it Cannon Beach or whatever it is, it starts to, your relationship to it changes. It becomes specific. It becomes really tangible, and it's something that you can lean into and relate to in a different way. And this could be any number of things. Forgive the examples again, but I just thought that was interesting of how a brand can focus and allow people to connect to it in a different way. And that's because brands have names, origin stories, histories, both old and new. I think the history piece is interesting because a lot of times, like working with brands and you try to get to the core of what it is they're all about. And you mentioned history, I think you're talking about like strictly the before times, but I think it's really important for a brand to stay on top of the history that's being made even today. And the space that that thing occupies in people's hearts and minds, and being able to speak to that too. And when it comes to changing and adapting your brand, kind of recognizing that and treating that as fundamental as well. So there's a lot of different dimensions, and I think that can make a brand really resilient in the face of changing times when they're able to look at themselves and go, okay, what is it that we have to offer people that's special to us, or that we think is special about us, and we want to kind of shout from the rooftops. And in a lot of ways, like kind of like those dimensions on the previous slide, brands operate as these kind of story machines. You know, they give people something to connect with. And that story can be the big story of a brand or kind of the ones, smaller ones within it. But that becomes really important because humans are narrative creatures. We kind of crave stories. It's how we make sense of the world, how we remember things. Like it's why people create songs around like things to remember them more. Like story is kind of the fundamental building block of how we operate as people. And because without that, we sort of get lost in the chaos of all the things being thrown at us and all the different things we need to remember. But if you can kind of string a narrative along, that becomes really easy to relate with. An example, there was an experiment done like in 1944 by Heidel and Simmel where they showed people shapes just floating around. You might be familiar with it, just shapes floating around on a screen. And the vast majority of people who they showed that to had some intricate story that they created around it. Only a very small percentage said, oh, what I see is just shapes bouncing around on a screen. And it was interesting that with the prompt of tell me what you see, people had these very elaborate stories. It was just crazy. People were like, one shape's being mean to the other, one's bullying it. Like, it's pretty crazy. Like, you can find the video too, but I think it speaks to like our natural propensity to be able to string a story together, sometimes when there is none. So if you can get really, tapped into that, and I think it's what allows us to kind of connect with people. And so that's also how they're able to mean so much to so many people. There's a number of brands that like to one person represents one thing, to another represents another. And what's important to call out with that is it's a brand that's able to do that. It's not by trying to be all things to all people, but it's about making who you are at your core relevant and accessible to all people. And I know it seems like a semantic thing, but there's one version of that where I think brands operate as kind of chameleons and sort of are changing all the time. And I think a good example, I remember there was like a phase where the most like popular line, like advertising lines or slogans were some version of like, you do you, which I've always like hated. Like it's a very not useful thing. Like, hey, you like consumer or like whatever you're already doing, just keep doing that. It's like, thanks, I don't need you to tell me that. Like, that's not very necessary. But I think powerful brands take that core truth of who they are and bring that to people who, maybe in spheres or walks of life that they wouldn't normally think to reach out to. So a semantic thing, but I think oftentimes an important thing. And even with a brand like Nike, to come back to that example, I think some of the coolest work to me from its history, like have been things that have done that have been able to take a core truth and kind of reach new different types of people with it. Because I think the core, like historically, it's like, oh, it's Michael Jordan. It's like these peak athletes. It's like a very like brooding athletic thing. But campaigns like Find Your Greatness or If You Let Me Play did this really cool thing of taking what's special about the brand, but reimagining that in a really interesting way. So hence the examples here. And then I wanted to end this section with this quote. Dan Wyden from there's a story that when reviewing ideas from creatives and stuff, and people were pitching to him, he would say this of like, maybe sometimes out of frustration, but in reviewing that, like, hey, just move me, dude. Like, and it's something that like I think about too, because again, like it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day or the nuts and bolts of it that you don't see the broader story. And so whenever you can, taking those moments to sort of zoom out and be like, what about this has the ability to move someone or connect with someone? It doesn't need to be like a life-changing revelation thing, but just like you get their attention in a very unique and special way. And so why is having a brand important is kind of the next phase of this. I think first and foremost, like a brand in a lot of ways is the difference between lots of things and your thing. And again, I think like sometimes when we think about what will be appealing about our brand or what we have to offer, we'll go to the things that other brands also offer to try to match that. But sometimes I think getting to what makes you special or unique, you got to kind of take a different approach to that. It's the difference between a Pinot Noir and a Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, or we got some Willamette Valley representation in here. It's the difference between mountain ranges and the Wallowas. Hey, there we go. Epic canyons and the Columbia River Gorge. And similar to what I did before with that example with Cannon Beach, like there's sort of this lightning rod effect when you get really specific with what you're talking about, that even if people don't understand like the ins and outs of that thing yet, there's that thing of you're like, oh, but I'm interested. You've made that connection to me and I want to know more. I want to be invested in this. That I think is sometimes something we take for granted, the power of specificity. That also becomes really important because I think a lot of times like the landscape in which we're marketing or existing can feel a bit like a Where's Waldo map, and it's hard to know what's what. There's like everything looks the same. It's kind of impossible to see what makes this brand different from this. But the important thing is, how do you differentiate yourself and stand out? You found that right away. I can tell. You're like, it's right there. How do you stand out? And so a clearly defined brand that's really in touch with its core is able to do that, and it's how you get the people you care about to care about you, how you keep them caring about you when different alternatives creep along, or when things change and there's different trends within the industry. Like time and time again, like on the brands we work on, for one reason or another, they're trying to figure out like how to weather the current moment, and 9 times out of 10 it's getting back in touch with something core to that brand that sets them apart, and sort of trying to bring that to life in an interesting way. Your brand also informs how and why you do things. So not just from a messaging standpoint or advertising standpoint, but how you operate and how you act. And so ideally, having that really, a brand identity that's really clearly defined, and that sense of who you are, how you speak or how you think or how you act or what causes you support and stand up for tend to come really quickly when you understand who it is you are. And when there's things thrown at you or curveballs, or new challenges, if you're really in touch with that, you're able to go, oh, well, it feels obvious. Like if this is who we are, then we should approach that this way, or we should do this, or we shouldn't do this, or we should, so I think that sort of is the North Star and the locus point for a lot of good stuff that's important to stay tapped in with. And so that importance, which I think I've been like circling around of finding your truth, and I'll be interested after this as we talk about it more, because that's the thing that you can then use to inspire, move, change people, whatever it is you're trying to do or affect in the world. It 9 times out of 10 comes from that deeper place of why it is you exist, what it is you're trying to do or accomplish, how you're going to reach people with that. So I think that's always a comfort too, and you're like, there's so much going on, but it's like, again, that fundamental starting point and core that you can kind of operate out of. And so how do brands adapt and evolve? I think at the heart of a strong brand is a really timeless truth, something that's unique to you. A few examples here, but one example that there was a time when P&G was trying to figure out how they would show up in the Olympics. They were sponsoring the Olympics, but they were trying to figure out what the natural tie in there was. And it was kind of tough to figure out like the relevance of their products or their brands in the Olympics. But the conversation came around to, well, like, we don't have much stake or connection to athletes, but we do to moms. And every Olympian has a mom. So maybe we should talk about that. And that was just a moment of like, after the fact seems obvious, but again, finding like what feels right for you in this bigger thing. And all of a sudden you're able to unlock amazing, creativity, messaging, and results. Every year, the like Dear Moms ads make me like tear up and cry, because like again, you find that thing, that for you is like the most powerful story or connection, and from there you're able to see like so many things come out of that. So yeah. And in rapidly changing times, like I kind of touched on earlier, it's really easy to reach for the things that everyone else is reaching for, but that can easily kind of make you get lost. Like I know like lately everybody's like, we need to be on TikTok. Oh, all the kids are on TikTok. And it's like, yeah, but why are you there? And so you can show up in the right places, but if you're not there for a reason, it can easily just feel like wallpaper or window dressing. So again, I feel like I'm just like hitting the same note over and over again, but it's like, it becomes really important, particularly in the different contexts. Truth is, like, a bright future for your brand requires that you understand its past. And like I mentioned earlier, it's not just like reciting those stories, but being in touch with them, because that informs like why it is you're here in the first place. And as you look to grow, if you're always in touch with that, then that core story that's sort of within, you know, your organization or brand or product will be the through line that you can take in different directions, but will ultimately be the thing that guides you. And so the things about you that won't change, you know, your reason for being, core beliefs, values, will help inform how you solve the things that will, which I guess is just reinforcing what I just said. Kind of got ahead of myself. This is a quote from Dan Wyden again that we use a lot, that Nike didn't discover the power of advertising, Nike discovered the power of its own voice. The biggest advantage you have in this business is your own voice, your own way of looking at things, thinking about things. This is where your power lies, which again seems kind of obvious, but time and time again proves to be true. And when a brand is really in touch with its truth, again, that very unique way of seeing things and viewing the world, or, you know, viewing a specific issue or viewing a specific thing, is what then brings people to it, because it's like, I like your take on things. I want to be closer to you. I want to invest in what it is you're doing. I want to care about the things you care about. And it has a really amazing effect. Any Goonies fans in the room? Okay, all right. Cool. I was trying to weave the Cannon Beach thing with the, you know what I'm saying? So yeah, again, it's how you get from a coach making shoes with a waffle iron to all, you know, the different array of stories that a brand like Nike is able to do, just for example. And I'm sure we could toss out a million different other ones, but the through line is kind of the same. And knowing this truth is especially important when it comes to kind of big challenges. I know, you know, we just been talking about sustainability a lot within the industry and things like racial equity. But again, I think, like, even if it feels completely foreign, there's usually a very creative way of connecting those two things, and approaching these really daunting subjects, topics, and trends in a way that feels right. And it becomes really important because, you know, at a time, this is like in 2020, when brands were sort of voicing their support and all this stuff, which was, you know, coming from the right place, it did call to mind the question, what is it at a certain point that you're really adding to the conversation? Because there's sort of this effect that, like, no matter what brand it was coming from, it just felt kind of like the same. And there's sort of like a snow blindness that I think can occur sometimes. Like, the most random one was Gushers posted one, and I was just like, what does Gushers candy have to do with? It just was a lot. So anyway, but asking that question, that recentering question of what is it that we have to add to this conversation, and being really intentional with that, and being very, I won't say rigorous, but like holding on that, I think will not only, like, I just think it'll guide you. So really important to call out. And sometimes, you know, it's not about speaking or saying the right things, but doing the right things, and asking the question, kind of, what difference can you specifically make? A bunch of examples here, but, you know, Patagonia telling people not to buy a new jacket, but working with the Common Threads initiative to you know, upcycle and recycle things is amazing. REI closing their doors on Black Friday, biggest shopping day of the year. Feels very counterintuitive, and I'm sure when somebody like proposed that, they were like, absolutely not. But again, it feels very true to that brand, you know, and even if you don't know a ton about it, you're like, I connect with that, you know, and Opt Outside feels like something I can get behind. I'm now a fan. You know, a surf brand, like the example here is from World Surf League, who, you know, very invested in the idea of sustainability, but the lens through which they do that a lot of times, it's interesting, is through surfers. And that's a very different approach than just sort of, you know, generic sustainability or protecting the oceans, but they have a very specific take on it. That's really exciting. And then last example, WNBA, there have been a lot of, you know, pushes for supporting women's basketball on a major level. But one of the most powerful things they did that actually wasn't like an advertising campaign was getting hoodies out to prominent basketball players and figures within culture to sort of represent that. And there became this sort of ripple effect within that. So again, like, what difference can you make? A lot of times doesn't require like big budgets and huge things, but just, again, finding your specific take on a thing and chasing after that, you'll find will often be the most fruitful. And last example on here is Nike with the maternity line. So making a product for mothers, who are athletes as well, to make life easier. Again, an action that they're able to do that has a power beyond what you would expect it to. And so a guiding question in all of this as I kind of wrap up, with no matter what it is, what is your point of view? And is it compelling, impactful, or interesting? And it can be a tough question to figure out, but a lot of times like a really refreshing one and liberating one to be like, this is how, we want to touch on this, or this is how we want to communicate this specifically. And what does, insert a blank, like whatever you want here. What does blank look like through the lens of your brand, or your destination, or whatever it is? Again, can lead to a very interesting path that sort of like culls out the noise and like all the complexities of the landscapes and kind of gives you like very tangible steps forward within that. And I know that sounds like a lot, like to try to figure out like philosophical questions and stuff. So it's not about reinventing the wheel or getting to some brilliant thing. I think it's about getting the most out of the wheel that you've got. So wherever it is you're trying to do, or whatever your goals are, objectives as a brand, asking those deeper questions, finding those kind of timeless truths, and holding on to them, because those stories last. Like from the early days on through, like there's a reason why like people hold on to things and pass stories down, is because they have power. So when you're able to find that for you, I think that can be something that is sets you up for a bright future and allows you to kind of weather any storms that come your way. So that's all I've got. I told you it was going to be high level and pretty basic, but I think the hope is like to just refresh and kind of touch on some basics. And hopefully it was helpful. I'll pass it off to Josh, but hopefully at the end we can get to some interesting conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Hey, thanks. That's super awesome. I am from Knoxville, Tennessee. I love everything here about Oregon. I wish other states could be here right now, hearing everything your amazing state and your tourism teams have to offer. So today I'm going to talk a little bit, when it comes to branding, about information and imagination. If you think about a Venn diagram, really, when those two converge, that's the amazing potential for where brands are able to come to life. I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about accessible tourism and disability inclusion, but what I would argue is that everything I'm saying here could be about any audience you want to be able to engage with when it comes to your brand. A little bit more about me. That's a picture of a blurry birth certificate from many, many years ago, and just my story. I was born 3 months premature, and the doctors told my parents not to name me. I only weighed 2.5 pounds, and I wasn't supposed to live. And my parents said, to heck with that, let's give him the strongest name we can, Joshua Bernard Zachary Loebner. And I survived. And then when I was 9, I had some headaches that I wasn't supposed to have, and I had glaucoma, and my left eye, which I couldn't see out of anyway, was removed, and so I've got a glass eye. And my right eye, I'm legally blind in it, which means everybody's blurry, so I don't know if you're looking at me or not, and either way, it's okay. But I've focused on disability inclusion and advertising and marketing and branding in my entire career, and I'm seeing some amazing positives through that today. And so it's just a wonderful conversation hopefully we can have. And so speaking of conversations, I also have a podcast. I do focus on travel and tourism amongst other industry verticals, but I co-host a podcast with another blind gentleman at the Expedia Group, and we interview any number of different destinations and tourism and travel brands and really ask them what they're doing to make their location, their attraction, their destination more inclusive to people. So if anybody wants to check that out, you can go to explorablepodcast.com. And then here I want to share that branding really is about a journey of love and hope. And as we heard, it's not something that just kind of finishes. There's no real definitive endpoint. Branding is a continuing journey, and we're just a part of it at this time. But through that, branding hopefully can be about hope, can be about love. And so here, just to dig a little bit deeper, to talk about branding, sometimes we get a bit myopic in our thinking, but what I would suggest is that branding is about conversations. Branding is about community. And ultimately, branding is about commitments. And again, the commitments that Travel Oregon is doing and everyone here at this conference, it's just phenomenal. So let's just dive in and talk a little bit more about information. And we know that from a travel and tourism standpoint, we're not about those old travel log books anymore or those foldable maps, but we've moved beyond that. Everything oftentimes now is in a digital world, our mobile devices, and branding needs to play a role there, and so does inclusivity, and how are we able to do that? So I have a personal kind of manifesto or methodology to my take on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sometimes those words can be translated into an acronym that could be challenging to remember, or even understanding how it fits within my role or anyone else's role. And so I've reinterpreted those letters and words to form ideas. IDEAS stands for inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, and successes. And it's critical to think about it in that standpoint. Whose ideas are important? Are people of color's ideas important? Are tribal ideas important and recognized and heard? Are Latinx ideas important? Are queer ideas important? Are disabled ideas worthwhile to listen to? And what I would argue is yes, that they all are. And ultimately the S is critical here, because oftentimes when it comes to branding, when it comes to marketing, sometimes DE&I can seem a bit esoteric, and even in the travel and tourism space. But there are opportunities from an equity standpoint, from an accessibility standpoint, to start to be able to incorporate measurable successes so that year over year you can say, hey, what we're doing is working. What we're doing is moving the needle forward in a way that's positive for as many people as possible. But when it comes to as many people as possible, a challenge with branding, at least in the past, that we're starting to shift away from, you see here is a kind of a bell curve. And in the middle is all the audiences whom we've been speaking with in the past for so long has been quite narrow. But the opportunity from an inclusive design standpoint is to really think about those people maybe who we haven't been connecting with, who we haven't looked to from a job hiring standpoint, who are marginalized, are potentially segmented away from the branding, the marketing, the advertising that could be connective to them. And these are audiences that have dollars to spend, that want to be brand loyal, that want to be heard, want to be listened, want to be accepted. And so there's an amazing opportunity for your brand to be able to maybe understanding we have had a dip over the past 2 years, and we're gradually going back up. If we want to increase that curve even more to welcome more people, this is the opportunity. Look at those audiences that you haven't connected with previously. So I want to talk about 3 goals when it comes to inclusive branding, especially in the travel and tourism world. The first is to start with communications. That's the most simplest thing. No matter if you're a mom or pop or a multinational conglomerate, communications is something that we can all be able to push forward in a way that is equitable and inclusive. Secondly, it's also about ensuring that the programs that we have in place, that the initiatives that we're moving forward with are ones that are accessible, inclusive, and sustainable. And then thirdly, travel and tourism is about places and spaces. How can we make sure that those places and spaces from a branding standpoint are welcoming? So just to dive through this real quick, a couple of things to note is that here it really is all about, I would argue, transportation. Sometimes we get a bit myopic with our branding and marketing, and we just think about our destination, our location, where our space and place is. But from my perspective as a disabled traveler, transportation is critical for me. And so there's an opportunity to consider, well, you don't have to spell out the entire narrative story about how to get to your location and how to leave your location. Incorporating some type of transportation content within your communications that shares the accessible and inclusive ways to get to and from your destination is a powerful story. Again, that I would argue that state level destinations and mom and pops sometimes forget to include, but it's significant and important. And then again as well, from looking outside of your brand, it's about the community that you're a part of, right? We're not just this one puzzle piece. We're a mosaic of destinations, of spaces and places that hopefully can all connect with one another. And in no way am I suggesting that your website, your social media, any of your branding needs to wholeheartedly shout out every single other brand that potentially may be a competitor, but to recognize that you have content that you can share to help elevate all ships to rise with that tide. And so community is important. And from a disabled traveler perspective, community is important to know. After I visit one of your spaces or places, where can I go to have an accessible stay, to have an inclusive restaurant experience, to do any number of different things. So remember where you are in your place in that larger puzzle mosaic. And then this is critical and important, and it's something that we've thought about in the past 2 years, but as well, your brand is here in the good times and the bad. Your brand is here in humanitarian needs, whether it's devastation from a forest fire, whether it's COVID, whether it's the challenges that are happening in Eastern Europe. What are some ways that your brand can be considerate, not only in those times that you want to welcome those joyous occasions, but also in those other times where it is more meaningful? And we heard earlier about the refugees that are staying at one of your state's hotels. So many amazing stories. And from an accessible and inclusive and equitable standpoint, your brand definitely needs to be there in these humanitarian needs. So just diving in a little bit further, communications is critical, of course, and you can welcome. And sometimes when people think of disability inclusion, they think of very rote information, and sometimes it's too succinct. Sometimes people think that the accessibility symbol is the only thing that welcomes people with disabilities, but there are any spectrum of different disabilities where we want to hear about so many different types of information. And so the more detailed you can be, the better. Be able to share as much information as you can. And you get to be able to share that by listening to people with disabilities, by hearing from those travelers with disabilities and travelers from other marginalized and underrepresented groups, to be able to make sure that if you have a page on your website that welcomes the queer community or Latinx or any other community, that you have listened, you have heard, and you're authentically incorporating communications to represent your brand. And in social media, it's just as powerful. I think sometimes when we think of communications, of course, going back to, travel and tourism is now on our mobile devices. We tend to simply think of our website, but when it comes to equitable communications, we need to consider that breadcrumbing, that omnichannel communications that connects from one journey point to another journey point to another journey point to guide people to be able to make that decision to stay at your hotel, dine at your restaurant, or experience your destination in a way that's meaningful. And so from an accessibility and inclusion standpoint, social media, brand experiences, think about the larger brand map that you have and how your communications can be just as impactful, not only on your website, but throughout all of your communications pieces. I pulled this up. This is from a Travel Oregon presentation a few years ago. And what I love about this slide is it talks about planning. When it comes to imagination, we tend to jump all the way to that one immersive and imaginative image or video or tagline that really drives the message home. And that's amazing and powerful. But to be able to keep hitting that drum beat, to be able to keep moving forward with imagination, it really has to continue with planning. That the planning is something that gives it such a strong foundation that you've got legs that you can continue to build on year in and year out. Even if the campaign continues to evolve, you'll still have that plan that says, here's our North Star, here's our movement forward that we need to stay focused on. And here's what else I love about Travel Oregon as well, is the campaign is so imaginative, it's so welcoming, but they also think of the various other components to be able to imbue imagination. And public relations, earned media can be just as imaginative as a 30-second beautiful ad campaign. And so public relations is powerful. Again, going back to that information. You can share information through imaginative ways. So if you're a mom and pop and you don't have the dollars to invest in a nationwide TV campaign, you can still look at different ways within your communications to convey that you're welcoming. And to say that you're welcoming is newsworthy, and I would argue would be able to gain you coverage in many different places. Just to share another example of inclusion and accessibility specific to the disability community, but it can connect with any other. This is Mesa, Arizona. Visit Mesa took the initiative to say, hey, we want to be able to welcome as many different people as possible, including those individuals that are neurodiverse, that may be a person who has autism and their families. And so sometimes disability gets lumped into the physical considerations, but disability, again, is a larger spectrum that is inclusive of intellectual and developmental disabilities and neurodiversity. And so Visit Mesa became one of the first accessible and certified communities to be able to welcome people with autism. Super phenomenal. And they do that in an imaginative way. It's not just a straightforward, hey, we've been certified, but they incorporated families into their campaign that suggested that these are authentic narratives and authentic stories that are meaningful and powerful. I did have some videos. They're not working, and that's okay, because hopefully we can get done with this monologue to have more of a dialogue. But you can go to Visit Mesa to find out more about what they have to offer. This video is from Visit Florida. They listened to people with disabilities, and they incorporated several very imaginative videos with the title called Limitless. That Visit Florida can be limitless and welcome as many people as possible across all abilities. They brought in Floridians with disabilities into these wonderful immersive and imaginative stories to be able to share what Florida meant to them. And that's the other interesting point to bring up, is that sometimes those marginalized and underrepresented communities are not from far-flung places. They're here, right in Sun River or Bend, Oregon, or Portland. That there are marginalized groups that maybe haven't ever considered the opportunity to do to travel in the state of Oregon. But the opportunity for you with your brand, from an imagination and information standpoint, you can welcome them as well. And then here as well, when it comes to being able to talk about that planning and talk about those commitments, this is just a small county in southern Georgia. They decided they wanted to move forward in a way, their destination organization wanted to incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they created basically an online educational toolkit for the hoteliers, the restaurants, and so many other attractions in their small county to be able to elevate those frontline workers to recognize what inclusion means. And so what does inclusion mean? This is a video from Marriott that I'm not going to show, but Marriott incorporates certain trainings when it comes to ASL, so that their frontline workers can easily be able to collaborate with that guest that's coming in that may be deaf or hard of hearing and uses ASL or sign language as their primary mode of conversation. And imaginatively, Marriott conveyed that within a commercial. So there are wonderful ways to be able to incorporate imaginatively marginalized groups such as the disability community. And then, again, talking about that three-legged stool of how your brand from a travel and tourism standpoint can be elevated from certain goals. Your facilities, your physical spaces, your brand experiences, whether it's in the natural environment or the built environment, there are opportunities to welcome. We worked with Explore Georgia to ensure and to start to plan a path forward so that each one of their visitor centers are as accessible and inclusive as possible, no matter what route a traveler coming into the state or out of the state or within the state takes. They could be able to be welcomed at these visitor information centers in a way that was equitable and inclusive and accessible for them. And this was a video from Dollywood. Dollywood is an amusement park in eastern Tennessee, and I serve on their disability advisory board. They took the initiative a few years ago to create a calming room or a quiet room. And a calming room or a quiet room is a place where, for example, if an individual who's neurodiverse or who has autism needs to be able to decompress because the experiences around them are taking them to a place where they don't want to go, where outbursts may occur. This is a place where them, along with their parents or other guests that are part of their group, can go to be able to move back in a way that gets them into a better place to be able to have an enjoyable experience for the rest of the day. And that is, creating a calming room is super inexpensive, and it's something that, even though I may not utilize the calming room as somebody who's blind and has low vision, I recognize that as a marginalized traveler who has a disability, that Dollywood as a brand is moving forward in ways that are welcoming people with disabilities in super positive ways. And so I think that the thing that I would come back to is your brand is more than just maybe what you think of your brand. Your brand is conversations that happen every day, the good, the bad, the ugly. Your brand is part of the community. That restaurant down the road, that seashore that's a few hundred miles away, they all connect in some way to be able to showcase not only what you have to offer, but what the community has to offer. And ultimately, your brand is about commitment. It's not this vapid, vacant veneer of, hey, we created a logo and it's badass. That's one compartment of what a larger brand is. And so hopefully, through my conversation, through Anthony's conversation, you're starting to see that your brand is living, is breathing, and hopefully is thriving through some of the things that we've shared with you this morning. So thanks so much.
Josh, you're always invited back because you just said my favorite thing, which is a brand is not a logo. All right, so now we have some time for questions. I think we just have the two mics up here, so we're going to ask you if you're comfortable to stand and ask your question, which would be great. So, does anybody have any? Oh, Ed?
We just bought some Moby mats to allow mobility, people to access our beaches easier. We're getting ready to buy a second beach wheelchair to do the same kind of thing. There was a picture of like a three-wheeled bicycle on a trail. Is there something like that that would allow greater mobility, say, for our trail system too?
Yeah, that's so the gentleman asked a question about, he mentioned that super congrats to you for getting that Moby mat and the beach accessible wheelchair. Those are phenomenal things, and kudos to you for doing that. He was asking about accessible trails and potentially wheelchairs that allow for more accessibility outside on an uneven surface. And that's a multi-layered question. And, one answer to first consider is the trail accessible in and of itself? And so that's a conversation to have with whomever is developing the trail to make sure that trail is welcoming from a width standpoint and from a structural surface standpoint to be inclusive and to be able to be used by multiple different mobility devices. But yeah, there are definitely wheelchairs out there that are suited more particularly towards trails. And those are ones that, similar to what you were just sharing about what you purchased for the beach, there are wheelchairs that are specifically made for trails and uneven surfaces outside. And I'd be happy if you shared your contact information. I can send you some examples.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, probably for you, Josh, my question is to your point of how brands evolve. And let's say, by way of example, I'm representing a small rural community.
Mm-hmm.
So skeptical city councils that don't have a lot of money to spend. So the time and capital that I have today, say as a staffer, and I want to spend it on building a brand, enhancing our brand. What's the best play that I have knowing things are going to change?
I mean, and Anthony, you're welcome to jump in on this as well, but the question was, or is, how to be able to invest wisely when it comes to ensuring your brand evolution from a proper pathway of delineation. And my thinking there is the first thing to invest in is auditing where your brand is to ensure that you know where some gaps are within your brand that maybe you need to bridge. If you don't audit your brand at first and don't know where you are and what challenges or chasms you need to be able to circumnavigate, then that's going to be an issue that's going to continue to further just be able to create challenges down the road. So if you work with marketing partners, if you have individuals on your team that focus on communications, if you've not drawn a map of those pathways that you're trying to connect with your constituents in the community and external stakeholders, if you don't know all those different places and spaces that you're engaging or not engaging, and whether those are inclusive or exclusive, then there may be challenges. And so I would say, number one, be able to audit your communications, and not only your communications, but who is manifesting or architecting those communications. Have you listened to potentially groups that are underrepresented or marginalized? And then from there, I showed 3 goals, and a facility goal is the most expensive. That is the largest investment. The least expensive investment is communications, making updates to content on your website, adding information to social posts. Like, you just need the human power to be able to update your website or add to your social media or be able to share your voice in different communications places that should be something you could be able to do right now with not adding any more dollars. Does that answer your question?
It did, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Vanessa first.
This is a question for Josh. How would you suggest getting the message to, you were talking about disabilities, and I'll use an example. I was at the Oregon Chocolate Festival last weekend, and there was a young woman with Tourette syndrome,
Mm-hmm.
and she was screaming and swearing and whatnot, and her mother or her representative you could tell she was trying to wrangle her, and a quiet room would have been great for her to know about.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get that information out? What's the best way to get that information out? And them to know the resources for disabilities, every type of disability. What would you suggest that?
Yeah, definitely. So if you have events that kind of come up annually, the opportunity there is that you're wanting to engage people about those events and let them know prior to whatever is taking place. You're more than likely going to use social media or other advertising to be able to create those timely milestones prior to it to get that consumer to take some type of action, go to a website, register, buy a ticket. And so at each one of those communication touch points, you want to be able to share that inclusive component of what your event has or doesn't have. Hey, look, I am not here to shame anybody because they don't have this, that, or the other when it comes to underrepresented minority groups. We're all at different stages along a path of welcoming people. And so really it just starts out with sharing what you have that's inclusive and maybe what isn't. And that's okay. It lets people know that you at least are very understanding of all the information that's out there. But to get back to that specificity, let's say you do have a calming room or quiet room at this event that you've collaborated with maybe one of the local autism community groups to be able to set this up. And the event is a build-in and a breakdown, and so that calming room may not be there forever. But if you can work with a local organization or university group to be able to set that up and to be able to facilitate it from a best practices standpoint, they're going to want to share that information with their network of families, with youth or with adults that are neurodiverse. And so that starts to be able to create a ripple effect of connectivity for those people who purchase that ticket to know what is inclusive or maybe exclusive or accessible or inaccessible at that event. And really, it's just about information, but making sure that you get the information right by talking with and connecting with and hearing from the right groups that you feel like you want to make sure are represented at your event.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think we had Mandy and then we'll go, is that okay? Thanks.
Yeah, this is for Anthony. How do you sell the importance of branding and developing your voice and storytelling to the higher-ups?
So yeah. So the question was, how do you sell your approach to branding and the importance of it in storytelling and voice to the higher-ups? Higher-ups as in within an organization? Okay. Yeah, that's a tough one. I think a nice way of doing that, if it maybe the direction or the story you're telling around that is not going to be received well or is going to feel new or scary, is to tie it back to a core identity or thing within it, within the organization itself, and sort of use that to justify the direction and reinforce that is always a nice trick. But I think too, I think any new energy or life you're bringing to it tends to be appreciated, even if it's not accepted. So, but I think the main thing is tying it back to a deeper truth or a deeper thing that is core to that organization or important to that organization. But definitely easier said than done, and lots of failed attempts at doing so. So I think that's an ongoing struggle.
This is for Anthony. I'm just curious, what steps do you take to help people find their why? Organizations that are still kind of lost and not super focused. How do you do that?
Yeah. So the question was, what steps do I take to help organizations find their why or their core thing? I think the first and most important one is just asking a ton of questions. It's helpful when you have a fresh perspective on that organization, so bringing someone in or talking to someone. But I think questions is kind of the main thing. To really almost lawyer-like, just, and it's not coming from a place of interrogation, but of curiosity, of just hey, when we let's strip away all this stuff, what is really at the heart of this? Just being really, really curious and asking a ton of questions usually starts the trip down the rabbit hole to find that. And even asking that organization what their ambition is or what their passion is, and through conversation finding the thing that makes them light up when they start talking about it or get kind of, you see the life come to them. That usually is a clue as to what that deeper thing is. So I think through conversation and questions is usually the path to kind of finding it. Yeah.
Just an example of when Travel Oregon went through our rebrand in 2016. It was important that we had Biden pushed and asked a lot of questions for us internally, but what was also really helpful is they also went out and interviewed partners. So we had the external view as well of it was our regional partners at the time, and so they're connected. But I think that also helped us it's helpful sometimes when somebody close to you can help you see your truth as well. And then it also wasn't just the marketing team interpreting it, it was our entire organization.
Yeah, that's a good point, because sometimes how you see yourself may be different from how others, and sometimes how others see you can reveal something that you don't you overlook. So totally.
I'm Hiram Toll. I work at Mount Ashland Ski Area in Southern Oregon. I had the pleasure of coming here 8 years ago, and the ski area hadn't opened for a single day. And so we have this idea of the next 50 years, and that's kind of that spurred a rebranding. And if I could talk to the higher ups, the success that we've had after that rebranding really tell the message of what Mount Ashland was truly about. We use what we call a DNA statement to really dig deep on what makes Mount Ashland very unique. And it became, the tagline is "What Mount Fun" since 1964. And the vibe of the ski area has changed, the interaction that we have with our community, our place in the world. We came up with our Nike swoosh, I know it's not about the image, but the image really our logo was Mount Ashland in text, I want something on the back of a bumper that people see and go, okay, that's Mount Ashland. We've achieved that over the years. And so that brand drives the success. So if anybody's worried about paying for consultants or think that consultant is a four-letter word, you need someone to come in with fresh eyes, because we're all focused on what we think the thing is. Folks like these will get you to understand what you really want. And so I would encourage anybody to come up through that. And also just work on a branding for the city of Ashland. We have yet to find out if that has next week, but we feel that it will change when the world changes.
And I want to speak
When we rebranded Lincoln City, and predictably, every person in town over the age of 78 but the way we smoothed it through was to have a special city council meeting at the North Lincoln County Historical Museum. And it began with the city council being taken on a tour of the museum and certain things being pointed out to them. And when we pitched the brand, we referenced all those things, where unless you truly hated the town, there was nothing to say but yes.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It's kind of a question for both of you. As we talk about voice and then cater to a wider, diverse audience, is it possible, because I think in hospitality, right, everyone is welcome. We're trying to speak with one voice to everyone. Is that truly an achievable goal, or do we need to really be developing different voices for different audiences?
No, go ahead, man.
Yeah, but the question was in voice and being welcoming to all, how do you speak to different groups who maybe you hadn't otherwise, and is that possible with one voice, or do you need sort of separate lanes? Is that the question? Okay. I think it a lot of times is a both and a lot of times what I see that happen sometimes is we try to cram other groups or audiences into the main thing, and you sort of give them a smaller slice versus figuring out like, what is it about this community that we can connect with and really understand deeply and speak to that specifically. So there is always a need for sort of the broad, big things, but I think you can do different groups and communities justice if you take the time to understand and to speak to them individually, because you don't want the collapsing effect where you sort of reduce the richness and vibrance of a group or a community or background or walk of life into a very narrow thing. So I think it's a both and.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And just as an example, within the tourism space, we worked with Airbnb to welcome the disability community by giving them their own dedicated space within the Airbnb website, airbnb.com/accessibility, which spoke to specific points that the disability community, disabled travelers, were looking to be able to ensure that they had all the right information and imagination to welcome them. But then as well, Airbnb took the initiative to create inclusive content within their campaigns, to not be singular with who their guests and travelers were, but to showcase people with disabilities in their campaigns and their commercials, and also to make their communications accessible through audio descriptions and captioning. So it's a bit of both, to be able to, for example, if you're celebrating Pride Month, to be able to have dedicated communications that welcomes the queer community, but as well to be able to recognize that that's not the only time that the queer community is going to recreate within your destination. 24/7, 365, all marginalized groups should be able to be welcomed in a way that says, come on in, our space is your space. And so, yes, there are opportunities to segment your voice to target specific audiences, but also ways to be able to welcome those marginalized groups within your broader communication stories.
After the last couple of years of us dealing with COVID and safety issues and all the things that are coming to us, what are the most important, maybe the three most important things that like a small rural community can do that doesn't have any diversity in it? I mean, we have one autistic child in spec ed, and we have, I don't know who's coming, but we've always felt like we had open doors. And now we don't know if we put flags, rainbows on our doors, or what's most important. The three most important things a small community can do to get with it, because we're not with it.
I think the first thing I would say is, number one, listen. And so if you want certain groups that may not be living in your community to recreate in your community, is there any way that you could somehow be able to use the services and research and insights that Travel Oregon has, or that a sister community has, or that some of the attractions and hotels may have, to be able to share what they know about marginalized and underrepresented groups. Or if you can conduct your own research, surveys, focus groups, listening tours, to hear from those underrepresented groups as to why they're coming, or maybe why they're not coming, that starts to build a foundation of insight that you could then leverage into your communications. Number two, communicate. Be able to share everything that you want to share about your community and why you're welcoming, and why it's important. If you've listened, hopefully you'll have heard the value of hanging rainbow flags or not hanging rainbow flags, and taking action on it. And then number three, collective commitment. That if you want to be able to welcome groups that maybe are different from your community, be able to have a commitment so that hopefully every different attraction in your community is moving arm in arm down that path, and that you have a commitment from the restaurant, from the hotel, from the event venue or the parks or trails that you have, that everybody is committed. And I'm not saying everybody has to make the same type of investment, but if you're all committed, then you're moving towards progress in a way that shows that you're here for today, but you're also welcoming tomorrow and welcoming those people that maybe haven't considered your small community.
I got a lesson about counting to 10 to see if anybody had questions. So I want to take it. That,
Oh.
Yeah.
Last thing I would add, because those are great, is I think, yeah, like all the things Josh said, but if a thing is important to you, you'll find the best way to do that. And I think sometimes taking a breath and not feeling the pressure to be reactive and to just do the things will a lot of times like ground you, and what you do eventually do will come from a much better place that feels really right for your community and where you're coming from. So taking a beat and yeah, if it's important, you'll figure out the best way to do it. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. I'm sure there's a scripted notes section for me somewhere, but the next event up is lunch, so enjoy, and that starts at 12:30.